Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to Production Modeling Corporation's AIA training presentation. Today's topic is how to subcontract facility scanning. Our presenter for today is Chris Mounts. He is the Director of Laser Scanning and Digital Innovation at PMC. Please note that all your microphones have been muted to prevent any background noise throughout the presentation as it is being recorded today. If you have any questions, I recommend utilizing the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will be holding a live Q&A at the end of the presentation where your questions will be answered. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, use the Q&A feature and we'll have Chris address the questions that you might have. Also, if you have any issues with sound or visual errors, I recommend utilizing the Q&A feature to open a dialogue between me and you so I can best help you as the presentation continues. As I mentioned before, the webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything, don't worry, as it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel at a later time. Now, before we start, I'd like to remind everyone to please provide your AIA number to receive your AIA credits. If you don't have an AIA number, don't worry, you'll still receive a PMC certificate for attending today's presentation. Many of you provided your AIA number upon registration. However, if you didn't, you can please provide it in the Q&A area to me so I can see it and track it, or you can feel free to email me at bhubs@pmcorp.com. I'll provide my email in the chat, so if you feel like you didn't add it or you are not sure, you can just email me and I'll make sure the tracking for it is so you get your certificate. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Chris to begin our presentation. Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Brian, and welcome everyone. So today we're going to be talking about how to subcontract facility laser scanning. This is one in a number of different classes that we put on here at PMC. These ones all revolving around laser scanning and point clouds and how to get the most out of it. Right. Start with just a little bit of background about PMC. So we opened back in 1979. We've got well over 700 clients and over 10,000 completed projects that we've done, 250 employees worldwide. And just some basis of scanning, we've done scans that were as little as one scan, and we've done single projects that encompassed over 20,000 scans. So we do have offices kind of around the world to support the various customers we have, with our main offices being here in Dearborn, Michigan, where I'm at, and then Nagpur, India. We also have scanning equipment located in Mexico and India to support work there. So, what do we do, right? So we opened back in 1979. Back then, what we were doing was industrial simulation work, kind of the earliest versions of digital twin. Over the years, that business has evolved and grown, and now we do a full range of reality capture. So laser scanning, we have industrial engineering services, 3D modeling services, simulation visualization services. And a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We'll start with just some introduction to scanning for, some people might not know, much about that. So I want to cover the basics, some of the vocabulary, those types of things. Jump into some pitfalls of poor RFQs, right? What you can expect if your request for quote is not good. Then some tips for generally subcontracting projects, followed by some tips for subcontracting large projects, which can be very different. And then some cost expectations, what you should expect to pay for this service. That will jump right in. A little bit about scanning. So scanning is going to take place in kind of four parts after the contract's awarded. We're going to plan out that scanning. This would involve you. You'll be engaged in that planning process to figure out exactly where we need to scan, when we need to show up, all the logistics of getting into a site. Okay. Then we show up on site to actually capture that work and record the information of the site using the scanners. then you have to register that data. So the work that's done on site, even though there is some on site registration that takes place now, understand that there is still work to be done once those people return to their office. The data does not go directly from the scanners, let's say, into Revit. There is a step in between that has to be done. Um, that's a registration, which is sort of a group term for all that work. It includes stitching individual scans together and alignment, and then we have to produce outputs from that data. Typically nowadays, these are going to be RCS outputs for anything Autodesk. I went a little deeper into planning. Um, Planning not only varies by supplier, but it also varies by the complexity of the job. If you have a relatively straightforward project, maybe a small school building, small commercial space where there's just not a lot to plan, there won't be very much that goes on in here. As the projects get larger and more complex, then, there's a whole other set of discussions over, access times, security requirements, training, any kind of background checks, things like that need to be done. All that has to be talked through. At a minimum, though, we should have a kickoff meeting before people show up on site. Well, we'll go over some of the basics, right? Who's going to be the main contact at the site, those types of things. Now we're on site, right? And this is based on the more traditional time of flight scanners or fixed scanners. These are scanners that sit on a tripod. They run anywhere from 2 to 15 minutes per scan. And importantly, they only see what they see from a scan. So we jump back over here, you can see all these numbers. These are where individual scans will be done. And you can see there's one on either side of doorways often, right? So, a lot of scans need to be done to get good coverage. Right. Nowadays, almost all scans are done capturing true color. You can still run them in black and white. In cases where access times are extremely tight, sometimes we'll do that. Black and white scans can be done in, as little as 30 seconds, sometimes less. So it just varies. But in general, expect about 2 minutes of runtime nowadays on modern scanners. That's going to capture everything the scanner can see in its line of sight. Right. As the projects get larger, we're going to talk more about this because it's one of the big failure points. They require at first targets. And these targets are artificial items that we add into the environment, and they let us attach one scan to the next. They can take a number of different forms. You're seeing a few of them over here. These are, for the most part, these are going to be temporary, even though we do sometimes do permanent installs. And they're going to be moved as a scanner moves through the space. This is very important that as projects get larger, that these types of techniques be implemented. Otherwise, the project will fail. We'll go into that a little more as we go on. Okay. So registration is, this next process that takes place. And this has to do with these individual scans. We look over here, all these numbers and the dots, these represent individual scan locations. Each one of those has its own origin point relative to the scan head. Again, this is for terrestrial scan work. Mobile scanning is a little different. But each of those has to be stitched to the one next to it. And so this is where if we're using targets on a larger job, right, we need to see at least 3 common targets between one scan and the next to get a geometric lock on those 2 data sets. In this case, what we're looking at over here on the right here, this is a relatively small job and it was done without targets and it turned out fine. As it gets bigger, that doesn't work. One thing to keep in mind is, like I said, just consider that this process does take time, and this is time after the people have left the field. On the largest projects, this process can take, a month sometimes to get through, depending on the volume, if there's 3,000 scans. Uh, After the registration process, we're going to get going with the outputs. And these, for the most part nowadays, is basically an RCS file that's going to be brought into Revit, AutoCAD, Inventor, really anything Autodesk. It might be a POD file if you're in Siemens or MicroStation, but those are the two main formats. But in addition, there's also some report data, some analysis data that can be put out. These are less common, but they do get used from time to time. Right? But the most common workflow for us on the majority of the jobs is going to be scan, register, output RCSs, model off the RCSs in Revit. And one last thing to talk about here is survey control. So for any of you that have ever engaged in civil work, you've probably seen machines like what's over here on the right, Total Station. Survey control is extremely important on the larger projects. And again, this is where we see a lot of projects fail. At some point, at some point, cloud to cloud, which is the targetless registration, will fail. The project becomes too large and the error between each individual scan becomes too great. And the registration literally starts to fall apart and diverge from real life. At some point, even those artificial targets, so spheres or checkerboards, even those will fail as the project gets larger and larger. Survey equipment allows us to distribute that error at a much greater scale and shoot individual points at a huge range very accurately. This is how you tie a large project together. If you do 1,000,000 square feet, let's say, and you don't use survey control, at an absolute minimum, it's going to take months to get that data properly registered together. Far more likely is it will never be accurate. There will be no way to ever make that data accurate. Okay. So, moving on, in our next section for today, we covered hopefully the basics of scanning. Obviously, there's a whole lot more, and we have a whole presentation on choices and reality capture that covers some of the more modern changes, right? The mobile scanning, the drone-based photogrammetry, those types of things. But for today, I wanted to keep that relatively short. We get right into really the meat of today's presentation. So pitfalls of poor RFQs. So in general, in an average year, we'll respond to at least 300 RFQs. They come from all different companies, size, shape, doesn't matter. And the quality of the RFQ seems not to match with the size of the company. Most have little or no quantifiable requirements other than cost, right? They just want to know a price. They don't ask, how many scans you're going to do, how long you're going to be on site. And then many lack even the most basic information, right? We get an address and asked if we can, what it will cost to scan. Well, that's fine if it's a one-story building that's easy enough to measure from Google Earth and is pretty standard. But most buildings are a little more complicated than that, and we need a little more information. So some stories on things where we have lost work because of, quite frankly, bad RFQs. So, this first one this was for an industrial paint shop, automotive paint shop. This is kind of, PMC's bread and butter work. We scan for all the automotive companies in the world at the moment, and digitize their plants, including installing permanent control in a lot of them, high accuracy stuff. So, like I say, this is what we do. This is kind of our core business. It makes about 40% of our business. The other 60 being more traditional AEC type work. And if we lose by 90%, something is way, way wrong. And we tried to talk to the purchasing people about this and couldn't get through, couldn't get a hold of them. And then we got called back later because the job had completely failed and they wanted us to try to help fix it and salvage it. And what had happened on this job is that the RFQ was actually pretty straightforward in what it wanted and actually pretty thorough. And it specified, for any of you who have been in an automotive paint shop, you know, there's multiple levels to a paint shop, including a lot of sub levels, platform levels, uh, large pieces of equipment and things like that. And the RFQ required that everything be scanned, that everything, including the tops of these large pieces of equipment, be scanned, that all the mezzanine areas be scanned, that all the levels be scanned, essentially a complete scan project of all of the data, that you would go inside of the ovens and the booths and scan inside of those. You would scan inside of the tanks. The person who got the work just chose to ignore all of that and used a mobile scanner on the floor level only. Um, again, the purchasing person just didn't understand this and accepted the bid as it was. The data was clearly unusable and just made no sense, right? So, if you're in the market and you're contracting this work out, the takeaway here is if you see enormous divergence in price, it likely means that the people bidding on the work are misunderstanding your RFQ. They don't know what it is you actually want, and they're bidding on two very different things. So if you see those large divergences in price, it's worth doing a call, checking in with them, making sure they all understand exactly what it is you're looking for. If it's a larger bid, do it in a group setting so that all the bidders all understand what you're looking for and that it makes sense to them. Right? Because the reality is here in the US is a competitive market for scanning, and all of us have competitive rates. So if they come in, even 30% divergent, you probably need to check into it and see what's going on. I would expect them to be much closer than that. Okay. Another one that we got, this was a company we were working with that does historical renovations. And in this case, it was the Smithsonian, the main museum of natural history in Washington, D.C. And we gave them our numbers for it. Someone else gave them their numbers. And again, they were divergent. They were tighter, though. They were only 20% or so. And after a few months, the client came back to us and said that the person that was doing the work was asking to double the fee, that they were going to walk off the job if they didn't double the fee. And what came out of that is, for us, we publish the number of scans we're going to do in our quote. So anytime we do a quote, assuming it's traditional scanning, you're going to see we're going to do 100, 200, 300 scans on your site, roughly. Right. And we put that number right in there so you know what you're getting. Because as we talked before, right, a scan takes 2 to 15 minutes to run. Right. The reality is the number of scans equates to the number of hours we're going to be on your site, equates to the cost of the job. So these people had planned out, and apparently they counted half the number of scans that we did. So they went into this, they gave what they thought was a reasonable estimate, but they hadn't done this scale and this size and this complexity of a job before, and they just grossly underestimated the number of scans it was going to take to do the work. Even for us, right, nowadays we've done almost every type of job that's out there. We're one of the largest scanning providers on earth at this point. But once in a while, we still get caught off guard, and we screw up a quote. I can tell you that if we screw it up, we're not coming back to you for more money. That's just our fault, and we eat it. But some other firms, especially smaller ones, right, they can't afford to do that. they're going to have to come back to you. So just make sure that everyone's bidding the same thing, right? Have some quantifiable results there. And the last thing I want to talk about is what we touched on earlier with surveying, because this is on larger projects. This is the number one problem that comes up over and over and over again. And in any given year, I would say, here at PMC, we'll get, it's not tons, but we'll get maybe 5 calls on very large projects that have gone bad. And they'll want us to fix the point cloud data. So they paid another company to do the job. They got the data and maybe they sourced it back out to have it modeled. And that modeling company said, no way, this data is garbage. We can't work from it. And so they come to PMC and ask us if we can fix it. Someone recommends or something, they get a hold of us and we'll take a look at it. But the reality is on big jobs, if a survey is not done, it cannot be fixed. There is no way to fix it, and you can't go back and do surveying after the fact. That doesn't fix it. So we've seen multiple jobs that, where we're talking, $50,000 to $100,000 worth of scanning work that is essentially trash because the people doing it didn't do survey. And really the takeaway from this, we'll talk a little more about it when we talk about the difference between small and large jobs, is that there is a huge difference between the companies that can do large projects and the companies that do kind of small and medium projects in this business. And do not hire a small, medium company to do your large project. That's going to go bad for you, just guaranteed. They don't own enough equipment. They don't own enough gear. They don't have the capacity to do these really large projects. But unfortunately, a lot of them are more than willing to give you a bid. Right. And so in this case, it can be talked about in a few ways. We've seen this, like I say, multiple times. So we've seen it in factories, manufacturing. These tend to be some of the largest projects out there. And what we've seen are things like a point cloud looks good and you start working on it over on maybe the east side of the factory. And then as the modelers are sort of working through towards the west side of the factory, they start noticing things like a building columns are starting to drift wider and wider. And so what maybe should have been 50 foot between building columns, by the time you get to the far end of the factory, they're coming in at 53 and 54 foot column to column, even though in real life they're 50, because that data is separating and pulling apart by that much. The other thing that surveying locks down is level. And so again, we see this a lot in warehousing, again, any large kind of volume spaces, is the scanning equipment can compensate for level to a certain extent, right? In other words, when you run a scan, right, that data is going to be, let's assume that the floor was perfectly level in the space. It's not, but let's assume it was. The scanner is going to hold that level pretty close. And especially depending on the type of scanner you use, it can be really close, but it's not great. And then you start adding the next scan and the next scan, and you start chaining these together through the space. Well, if each one is off by even 1/100th of a degree out of level, all of a sudden, by the time you get to the end, your entire site is going up a hill, and your floor can deviate again by feet. This is not workable data. Modelers will have an almost impossible time dealing with it. And it's not just a matter of, oh, well, we can align it and tip the point cloud. One, that's actually a very difficult thing to do because it's never out of level in only one plane. But even if you somehow get it relatively flat, it's not consistent. Each scan is off by a little bit. And what you find is you're chasing this around this huge point cloud and each thing is off. right? So again, the takeaway here is understand what the limits are, understand when you need surveying to be done. Um, and then you need that surveying to be done correctly, right? I can tell you from our experience scanning is we have a lot of people who scan and they do very good work at scanning. Of that, only a small subset surveys because survey is just much more technically demanding than the scanning part. So again, small places are probably not going to have this and not going to be able to deliver on the large projects. Hey, so that let's jump into some tips on subcontracting projects. So, for us, we always say we just the absolute basics we need is what is in scope. Um, is it the whole building? Is it the roof? Is it the outside? Does the building have basements? Does it have more than one basement? Um, do you only want this one section scanned? Um, and those basic ideas of, what is the scope? Ideally, what we'd love to have is some kind of rough layout, a marked up PDF that says, okay, this is a scope area. And we understand, right? If you had perfect PDFs, you wouldn't be talking to us. So we understand that whatever you have might not be accurate enough, but it's good enough for us to put a bid together for you and estimate it. Worst case, we see this a lot in commercial buildings, older buildings, is there is nothing. And then we just need some help, right? We can maybe go and pull some tax records and get at least what the city thinks is the square footage of the building. Um, or we can measure it in Google Earth, but that can be a little tricky on some of these complex older buildings to understand the stack up and how many floors there really are. Okay, but somehow we've got to figure out the square footage. For us and anyone else in this business, the square footage is going to drive our scan counts, which is going to drive the cost. What we put together for your estimate. Hey, the other thing I would add to this is we have never in our history had someone come back and complain that we scanned too much. But we often have people come back and say, I wish you just would have scanned another 10, 15, 20 feet out further. So consider that when you're doing this, right? Adding a couple more scans to pick things up is not going to add a ton of cost or time, but it's going to ensure that we don't have to go back. Okay. Um, so we talk about some basic requirements, right? Usually what I like to know is what is your work on this site, right? In other words, likely everyone on this call, you're contacting us because you have a project at this site that you need to accomplish, and we're going to help you accomplish that by as-builting the space. So what is your work, right? Are you going to rip this thing down to the bare studs or the concrete walls and start over? Are you going to pull all the MEP, rip the ceilings out, right? We need to know that because then you don't care about any of that information, right? You just need to know the footprint of the building so you can do your work. But maybe you're going in and you're retrofitting the MEP systems. Well, we need to know that a lot, especially in buildings with drop ceilings, because if we're scanning above drop ceilings, this is a very different workflow. So we need to know that kind of stuff. And then are there any special items to consider? Um, this can range, we run into all kinds of stuff, right? From security clearances, let's say at airports and things like that, and government buildings. Some jobs require that we be full-time escorted, meaning that we have someone who escorts us around everywhere. Understand that's really important that we know that because our history shows having a full-time escort cuts our productivity in half. In half. We will be there twice as long. And that, if we aren't told about that ahead of time, that will be an extra, right? That's going to come your way. Are there, for like hospital works, can be special vaccination requirements, things like that. Any of those kind of weird things we need to know about. We need to know times, what times we can be in there, right? How much access we have. In general, we like to work anywhere from 10 to 12-hour days to sort of maximize the mobilization time of setting up and getting there. So, can we do that, or are we limited? We just did a huge factory out in Canada, and we were limited to 6 hours a night. Those things affect the cost. Okay. So, as jobs get bigger and smaller, right? So right now we're talking about kind of small and medium-sized jobs, and I'd put that cutoff at really, it really depends on the exact building, but somewhere maybe around 100 to 200,000 square feet. That would be the upper end of a medium before we're getting into large buildings. Okay. Um, but some basics you should request. Um, how many scans will you do? What scanner settings are you going to run? All right, so you know how many points you're going to capture. This is less important nowadays, the number of points, than it used to be, because all modern scanners they're so fast that we capture probably more points than you need. But it's still worth asking. How many scans, as we talked about earlier, right? That's a critical one, because if I say I'm going to do 300 and someone else says they're going to do 100, you probably need to talk to both of us, because one of us doesn't understand what it is you need. Demand a schedule, always a schedule, right? How long are people going to take? Again, because we see this, right? So there are a lot of really good scanning companies in the US in particular, but there's a lot of very, let's call them young scanning companies. One person with a scanner kind of thing. As these jobs, even a 200,000 square foot job, if it's one person in a scanner, they're likely going to take far longer than will align with your schedule for your project. So understand, right, what that schedule is going to look like, how many days on site, how many days to register, how many days to get the final output data, basically how many days until you have, if you're not having us do the modeling or someone else, how many days before you have workable point clouds in your hands from the start of the first day on site. A quality report, right? These are spit out by all the registration software now. Some examples of that over on the right. You don't actually need to know how to read this. We're happy to help you understand if you do want to know, but just asking for it can be a cue of whether or not these people that you're bidding out to have it together. What is their quality control process? Do they have one? Is it formalized? Does it go through different release gates before the data gets delivered to you? Again, this stuff can matter, right? Especially as projects get bigger, even if we're at that high end of the medium, right? The 100, 200,000 square foot. If you get RCS data and you pull it into Revit and you see it's messed up at that point, they have to go all the way back to the beginning of that registration process. And that whole process has to be done over again. And then you're going to get new data, right? And on 100,000 square foot building, let's say, you might be delayed a week because of that, for an error they should have caught right at the registration process, and they didn't, right? And then they spent days creating these exports. And once those exports are made, they cannot be fixed. They have to be recreated. So lastly, capture what works. So if you've done these before, and we have a lot of people say they had some bad experiences, but we also have people say they had really good experiences. Capture those good experiences, and make sure you explain that to the people you're bidding it with. Hey, we worked with this other company, they did this, worked really well for us, right? Because how you work with that data is going to be unique to your organization. So let us know, up front what worked for you in the past. Hey, so, if you want to be a little more thorough, we have clients that want to do this. You request a preliminary scan map, right? There's an example over here on the right. And honestly, for, a building of this size that we're showing here, normally PMC would not do this. This is not a big enough job to warrant this kind of work for us personally, we would just go out and do the work and it would be fine. Our team knows where to scan. A complete list of what scanner settings they're going to run, proof of certification of their equipment. Is their equipment up to date? Is it certified? Um, a copy of their QA plan, right, where you can verify that in fact they actually do have one. References, right, and example projects. And so the one thing I like to say about this is, because there was a time where PMC was sort of one person with a scanner, right? And we got our start doing that and built up. A lot of these kind of things are going to be hard for those companies to give you, right? They're not going to be able to necessarily give you references. They're not going to be able to give you example projects, especially nowadays where everyone wants us to sign an NDA. If you have a relatively simple, relatively small project, I would recommend giving, those independent people a chance. As long as they impress you when you talk to them on the phone and they seem knowledgeable. If it's a smaller, 5,000 to 10,000 square foot job, right? They're gonna do that well, right? If they have any knowledge in this space at all, the job's gonna go good. They're gonna do it correct. Don't be afraid to work with them, but understand, right? They might not have a fully documented QA plan because it's one person and they just make sure their work is right and give it to you. But as the jobs get bigger, right, and the stakes get higher, right, especially on these large projects that we'll talk about in a minute, you can't risk that on an unqualified supplier, right? You can't have your project delayed by a month or 2 months while they try to fix data that's messed up. Hey, deliverables, right? What do you need? Again, this goes back to that question, right? What is your project? Um, what is it that you need to achieve with the data that we're going to give you? Um, how is it going to get shared? Things like that. Um, for us, so for example, if you're subcontracting out the modeling work and we're just doing the scanning work, we can help you transfer that data to your modeling partner, or maybe you're a larger firm and you actually have a modeling group, that's working out of, let's say, India, right, where most of this work's done nowadays. We can help you get the point clouds to India using our private connection that we have to India. Much better than you're going to be able to do that, but we need to understand that you need that done. Um, what else are you doing with it? What kind of web viewer do you need? What kind of walkthroughs are you going to do? Are you using this to show off the property? How many user accounts do you need? Consider alternates carefully, right? So, I say we do these other classes, in particular, the reality capture choices class. There is a big difference between fixed tripod scanning and mobile scanning. Um, those differences are closing, and the data coming out of the mobile units is getting much, much better. But understand what these alternates are, right? If you asked for one type of scanning and a provider slips something in, if you don't know what it is, figure out what it is and make sure it aligns with your goals correctly. And then don't forget to enforce your contractual requirements, right? So if you have pass downs, whether those are insurance requirements, NDA requirements, security requirements, those types of things. Again, one other one, right? Depending on the size of the company you're working with, we end up signing a lot of the standard AIA contracts that are paid when paid. Understand that some of the smaller firms cannot do that, right? They are literally one person in a scanner. They need to get paid right away. So, keep that in mind. Don't drop that requirement at the very end on them after you've had 3 meetings and you've gone through all this stuff and your company requires the use of that contract, right? Make sure that's known up front that, it is a paid when paid, because you're going to need to work with firms that can float the money for longer. Hey, We're actually going to cover cost in more detail here in a minute, but it can vary quite a bit, right, depending on the exact requirements and what we're doing with the data. Processing can take time, a lot of time on larger jobs. Even on smaller jobs, they was saying quality mistakes cost days. So they need to be caught early and not get to the very end. Um, and lastly, something to keep in mind, the good subcontractors out here in my business, and there's a few dozen I would put in that group here in America. Um, they'll deliver quality data on time most of the time, right? I don't care how good we all think we are at doing this. There will be projects that have problems, and the good subcontractors will deal with those problems. They'll be upfront with you on those problems, and they'll let you know that they're getting taken care of and what they're going to do to correct it. Right? This could be, we've had jobs where a piece of equipment became faulty out on site and we had to go back. The data is not checked in real time on site. It's stored in the scanners, and then some of the stuff doesn't show up until you get back to the shop. We keep our equipment serviced and checked every year, but sometimes this happens. And just keep that in mind. Hey, so jumping into, some of the larger projects that are out there. And these can be commercial buildings, or certainly, commercial spaces that go into the million square foot and up range. A lot of times these are industrial, warehouse, those types of spaces, that are going to be very large, right? And yeah, what I say is if you're expecting a bid maybe over $50,000 for scanning, that definitely puts you in the category of large projects. There's a trade group that we're part of called USIBD, U.S. Institute of Building Documentation. They have forms that you can use that are very detailed that will let you kind of itemize exactly what you're looking for. In particular, we're not talking too much about modeling today, but on the modeling side, I think is where this really becomes important, understanding exactly what you want to see modeled and to what level of detail. And you can go to usibd.org and you can get those documents from them. Definitely, if you're spending $50,000, demand references and call the references, right? And check them. Like I said, when you start talking these really, really large projects, if there's, in the US, maybe 2,000 scanning providers out there, of that group, I would only trust a few dozen tops with doing million square foot plus jobs correctly. So you'll make sure the people you're talking to, right nowadays, it's easy to throw up a website that looks good, that looks professional, looks like you got 1,000 employees, but it turns out you got two. So verify that they've done large projects before and that they were delivered correctly and on time. Definitely require proof of a documented QA plan, right? Make them prove to you that they have a plan, and that your data is going to be checked multiple times before it gets to you. And lastly, it's becoming more common nowadays with people we work with. We're getting data security and backup questionnaires. If we go out and we scan for you at this million square foot site and that took 3 weeks, we bring that data back, we work on it in the office for another 3-4 weeks, and we're just about to ship that data to you and deliver. And because we were sloppy with our network security, we get all of our data encrypted and we can't deliver it to you. Right? This is a huge problem. So, again, on these larger projects where the stakes are higher, ask some of these questions of your supplier. Right? So this section, we're going to go through some costing examples and just to give you some ballpark ideas of what to expect. Obviously, what we're looking at are PMC's numbers. Like I said, it's a very competitive business. I suspect you're going to find everyone else's numbers are roughly in the same category. Okay. So, when we're looking at kind of traditional, this The scanner you see here on the right, the most popular scanner out there, the Faro model, but there's ones from Leica and Trimble. These sit on a tripod and they run in one stationary position. They're picked up and moved. This is sort of like the gold standard in scanning, right? This produces what everyone expects when they talk about scanning. And these are the prices, right? It can vary quite a bit. Like I was saying, above drop ceiling, those are prices in addition to the base scanning price, right? So if you need to go above drop ceilings, it goes up quite a bit. That's a tremendous amount of work to do that and to move through a space. And this does not cover, weird oddities like hospitals. Hospitals are very difficult to do work in. Like I said earlier, PMC's done work almost everywhere. So it gives you a general ballpark of sort of what these prices are. And the variation is going to come down to a few things. The density of the space being scanned, right? Is it an empty warehouse or is it a full warehouse? Are you wanting us to scan up and down every aisle in the warehouse, or can we skip and go every other aisle? Right? These are all going to affect the cost. Okay? Same with all the other numbers, right? How densely packed is the industrial space? Basic office, dormitories, schools, that kind of stuff. I can tell you a modern school costs less to scan than a historic school, right? Because the modern buildings are just simpler, they're easier to get around in, right? They feature bigger rooms, less hallways. Older schools tend to be a little more complex. So now this is with mobile scanning, right? These wearable units, a few years ago, these were pushed around on carts. Now this is sort of really the only one that's out that produces good data, I think. This data is comparable to the terrestrial. It's a little less accurate, but the data quality is actually very good, and the capture can be very fast, right? And so obviously you can see all these rates are substantially cheaper. Okay? That's because the speed is much, much faster. Now, there are some weird areas as the size of the project gets bigger or smaller, where there's some strange overlap where traditional scanning becomes cheaper than mobile scanning. Because traditional, we can go a little further in the square footage using targets, which is still pretty cheap, but not survey. But in the mobile scanning, we have to do survey at a smaller square footage size. Otherwise, this data starts to really fall apart. So there is a weird gray area in the middle where actually terrestrial can be cheaper than mobile. But for most jobs nowadays, mobile will be cheaper, and it works really well. Hey, I know I said we weren't going to talk BIM, model development stuff, but I threw this in here just because, I would say probably about 80% of our customers, they don't just want the scan data, they want scan and model. So we definitely do this. We have a huge team that does this, almost 100 people. And these are our kind of going rates of, what you can expect to pay. Again, even these ones that don't really have variable amounts, they do vary, right? Depending on the exact specifics of the work we're doing. And stuff like above drop ceiling again, and the modeling is also very complex. But it gives you, sort of a rough ballpark idea of what you're looking at, depending on what you ask for and, the specifics of the modeling. Right. And with that, we're going to jump into Q&A. I hope everyone learned something today from what we were talking about, and ready for any questions if there are any, Brian.
Yep, thank you, Chris. So we had several questions come in throughout the presentation. I'll get started with those, but please, now's the time to utilize the Q&A feature. If you have any questions that you want to ask Chris specifically, we'll do our best to get through them as quickly as we can. We have several questions already, but feel free to please add to it. So Chris, the first answer we had come in, does the registration team have access to speak with the scanning team from the field? Most often we find errors in this step in the translation.
Well, yeah. So for us, absolutely, and it's a constant kind of feedback loop where our registration team publishes reports back out if there's any kind of problem back to the scan team, and that just happens sort of perpetually. In general terms, our team has been doing this so long that we tend to not have the problems we have are specific to individual sites, and are kind of unexpected. Um, so as an example, we scanned a post office years ago, and there was like a holographic eagle on a lot of the postage. And that absolutely blew the scanner out. And we had these huge eagles floating in the space. And they just made an absolute mess out of the scan data. So, it's kind of stuff like that, right? Where we feed it back to the team, but there was not necessarily a way to catch it ahead of time. But, certainly this is a process that's taken years, right? And we've worked through that. It's to the person who's asking that question, they're correct. That is a challenging break point.
All right, thank you, Chris. The next question we had, is scanning weather dependent? Can you scan in the rain or snow?
The answer is yes, it is weather dependent. There's a limit to how much you can scan, or how heavy the rain or snow can be. Um, if it's a relatively like a misty kind of rain, the scanners can typically hold up in that. Um, as it gets heavier, you just can't because it would damage the scanner. In the case of snow, again, a little bit of snow is okay, but the scanner will scan the snow. And so if it's a heavy snow, your point cloud can become unusable because the scanner scanned a ton of snow and you can't actually like find the building wall anymore because you've got points all the way through the space. What is open air but was filled with snow.
All right, thank you, Chris. Another question we had, how do you rectify inaccurate measurements? We had a survey and the scan company came in 12 inches short. We measured the building and the surveyor was correct.
I this is what I talked about with some of the pitfalls. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad scan companies out there that are doing shouldn't say they're bad, they're inexperienced. And they deliver bad data. I I can tell you on smaller projects, right? We would just that just does not happen anymore, right? Our scan data will match the survey. Um, these are the things, these are checked, right? These are sense checked. This is part of our QA process on the scan data. Um, if it's a smaller project and you're seeing a foot separation, there's a good chance that what they did is they did cloud to cloud registration, and that maybe on if it's the outside of the building or the inside, there's some kind of repetitive feature in that building, and it pulled together by a foot. Um, the one I heard about was at the Daytona Speedway. They had repetitive grandstands. And the person who scanned that scanned it and registered it. And they actually took an entire section of grandstands out because it was a repetitive feature and they didn't have unique control between it. And so it collapsed the whole point cloud by 50 feet. Um, these things happen. Whoever did that, it should have never escaped from them, right? They should have been cross-checking that to make sure that it was correct. And then, if as jobs get bigger, right, we're running survey control too. And so we then know our scan data doesn't match the survey, something's wrong.
All right, thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Another question we had, I work a lot with existing and historic buildings and sites where there are often unique families in Revit. How do you recommend we communicate the relationships needed between Revit families for components of the building? Like we may treat trim, sills, casings around windows differently than the windows themselves. So we'd like them to be set so that we can do that in Revit.
So yeah, I need to actually put together a whole similar presentation here for modeling. The way we handle that is we start with we have a document that we call historic level of detail that we send out pre-bid so that you can select what kind of historic detail you want. Essentially how detailed do you want us to get in the historic model? And then the specifics of how that model is constructed is handled at kickoff when our modeling coordinators will meet with you and they'll go through step by step, looking hopefully at past projects you've done. And they'll turn that into what we call our project execution guide that goes out to our modelers that tells them exactly what they need to do. And typically that's where that type of stuff gets resolved.
All right, thank you, Chris. Another question we had, can you show examples of detailed scans of elevations of terracotta buildings? I'm looking for extreme detail showing each stone comprising the entire elevation of an 8-story building, for example.
We can send some samples. I don't have anything ready to pull up right now. What I can say is 8 stories is doable. As the buildings get even taller, it gets even a little more complex to do that. And the exact hardware you use starts to become very important. So you don't lose detail up at height. But what you'll always lose, right, is that these things are line of sight. And so if you can only get access um off the cement outside of the building, right, as you look up these buildings, especially these historic buildings, they tend to step back, right? And they get smaller as they go up, and there's usually like balconies and things that are stepping back. You can start to lose a lot of data to occlusion as that happens. And there are techniques, right, that let you see that, including booming a scanner out of windows in that building. But that involves multiple things, right? One, are you going to be allowed to do that? Um, if you're doing that, you should close the sidewalk, right? You should not be sticking something that heavy out a window and not closing the sidewalk. Right. And these things start to add up from like a cost perspective. These are these kind of outlier jobs for us where we need to go over a lot more detail with you to figure out exactly what it is you need. And honestly, nowadays, we didn't touch on it in this presentation, but we would tend to do that type of work with drones and photogrammetry, which can provide shockingly good data. And we can send some of those, Brian, if you can remind me, we'll send some of those screenshots out too. Right, and those, because we're flying a drone, right, we can get a lot closer and do things that let us see details that would be very hard to get otherwise.
All right, thank you, Chris.
Yep.
Another question we had, when do we need to know if we'd like photographs coordinated with the point cloud scanning?
So I'm not sure if this means like the scans are in color or if there's going to be supplementary photos taken on site. So I guess I can cover both. Nowadays, most places are going to assume that you want color scanning. Um, I can't even remember the last time we did black and white scanning. It used to be back in the day that running a black and white scan took 2 minutes, taking photos took, up to another 15 minutes. And so it was very common to not do photos with the scan. Nowadays, and we didn't really cover this, but the cameras are built into the scanners and they run after the scan is run. So the laser does its thing, and then the cameras come in and are in parallax with the laser, and they take photos and build 360 photos. So that's one option, right? That's typically done. The second one is if you want like supplementary photos. So we were into this for any number of things. So it could be historic and you want some zoomed in photos of details. Maybe you want to piece together like a photo mosaic of an elevation view, those types of things. That's all discussed obviously ahead of time before we go out on site. And then for a lot of our multi-site, where we're doing, 500 fast food restaurants, we're also capturing a lot of additional information like the electrical panels, the meters, um, any of the major equipment, serial numbers, asset tags, those types of things. But in any event, we need to know before, probably before we bid, and definitely before we go out on site, what you need.
All right, thank you, Chris. Another question we have, how important is it to know the LOD needed for the Revit model, and when do you need to know that?
At bid time, right? It does matter. And I tell you, if you have a relatively modern building, it doesn't matter too much, right? We have all the families and the exact LOD. Well, first you have to define what exactly we're talking about with LOD. So we're talking like how detailed the geometry is in the model. Um, you know, in commercial modern stuff doesn't matter. It just goes fine. In historic, it matters a lot. The cost between a relatively low detail historic model and an extremely high detail historic model is easily double the cost.
All right, thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Another question we had, can you address applicability to smaller residential work?
Yeah, we do. So assuming that you're doing like single family home kind of stuff, or even small apartment complexes, we do a fair amount of that, and we try to keep it aggressively priced as we can. What I can tell you is I wish I could tell you different, but you probably want someone local who can knock that stuff out for you, because travel cost is going to be a problem. Um, but luckily, like I said, right, there's a lot of small operations and scanning out there where it's, one person in a scanner and you can get this done pretty cheap. Um, Alternatively, if you have capacity, we have a program where we'll actually loan you one of our scanners and walk you through the process of how to capture this on your own. And we'll mail it to you. You go out, you scan, you mail it back to us. You don't have to touch any of the data. We'll take care of all that, and get it produced for you. So that's an option too.
All right, thank you, Chris. Another question we had, can you help us geolocate a point cloud when you complete a scan? Oftentimes, we have clients who own multiple buildings on a campus who will eventually want their buildings to be virtually connected by location and elevation.
Yes, yeah, this is something we do all the time. So with the survey, right, we can actually put this building into correct, whether it's state plane or whatever they're working on. We can get that information and capture it. A little more complicated of a topic when we're talking on the modeling side. You don't want to model a building in its actual geolocation. So you're going to get into shared coordinates and that kind of stuff. And that's all, that part of it is covered in our kickoff, our modeling kickoff, where we do our execution guide. We go through all that and make sure that we produce it. One thing to keep in mind is in Revit and when models, you can have two different coordinate systems that exist within the Revit model. So you can have your building squared up for modeling, and then you can use shared coordinates to put it into its proper rotation and geolocation on a site. You can't do that with point clouds, with processed RCS files. RCS files have to exist within one coordinate system. So we can produce two different RCS files for you on two different coordinate systems, but it's a pain, right? You got to have two sets of this huge data floating around.
All right, thank you, Chris. Another question, could you discuss scanning above the ceiling to obtain structural framing elements? In some cases, scanning a structure requires access to small spaces that a body mounted would be difficult to enter with. How does one obtain scans of structural info in attics, confined spaces, or other areas with small obstructions that require some level of climbing, etc.?
Yeah, so it just really depends on there's a lot of different things here, right? So I'll cover drop ceiling first. So assuming we can get the tile up, um, there's actually at least enough interstitial space there to pop a tile and get it out of the way, we can capture it. But keep in mind the tighter that space between bottom of deck of the upper floor or ceiling and the drop ceiling and how much stuff is packed in there means we have to do more and more and more scans because we can't see anything beyond maybe the one tile we popped out. We don't run into that too often. Usually there's at least a decent amount of room in there. And we can see, by popping one tile, putting the scanner up in there, the fixed scanner. Yeah, and like I said, this is never done with mobile. This is fixed scanning. Um, you pop the scanner up in there and you can scan usually a radius of say 5 tiles around where the scanner goes up and get pretty good information. And then you move, 10 tiles down, pop another one, and 5 tile radius around that. And you move through the space like that. Um, Attics, things like that. These are assuming they're safe to enter, right? Which is a thing we don't talk about, right? But sites need to be safe. We can't send people somewhere where it's simply not okay for them to be. But assuming it is safe for them to be and they can climb a ladder, they can put the scanner in a backpack, they can climb up a ladder. But usually the trickiest part of these spaces is getting them to attach to the rest of the space. Because if we're shooting through maybe, a 3 foot square opening, um, from a data alignment standpoint, that's not really good. We can do all the targeting and stuff we want. We're still locked in this little tiny window to get through. And so in those cases, we actually deliver 2 different data sets, and the attic space will be manually aligned as best we can to the rest of the data. But understand that it won't, it might be off by an inch. And so if you're looking for like exact, penetrations or something between the spaces, it's probably not going to be perfect. Um, if we have multiple access points and bigger openings, then it's a lot easier to hold control on that. But in general, I mean, this is, stuff we do. We've scanned above, above domes and huge theaters and things like that. Um, if a person can get in there, if we can somehow get a scanner in there, and say we have booms where we can stick it into chase openings, we can have someone cut a small hole in the drywall, we can stick a scanner through and capture what's inside of there, scan elevator shafts, all that kind of stuff.
All right, thank you, Chris.
Yep.
The last question I see in the well, there's another one just popped in, but the next question: are there any specials that you offer or we offer?
Oh, I feel like this is a plant from our sales team here that's probably signed on. That's okay though. They got a job to do. We actually are. We're running 10% off all scanning for the first quarter this year and 20% off modeling for the first quarter. So if anyone is interested, please feel free to reach out. Sorry for the advertising plug. Try not to really do that in here, but there it is.
All right, thank you, Chris. And last, someone wanted to say thank you for the presentation, and that we hope to contact them for other upcoming presentations.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah,
so
the
if you
only
want
thing
to,
I'd add to that, Brian, is if any of you have stuff you'd like to learn more about, please reach out and let us know. And if enough people suggest a topic, we're happy to put together a presentation on it.
yep. And do you have your email on the next slide to potentially if anyone wants to reach out directly
Yep,
to you?
there you go.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. So someone did say, where should we reach out? Again, there's Chris's email. Also in my outro, kind of was going to touch on, if you keep up to date with our website, we tend to try and do this once a month or every other month, do an AIA training presentation. Chris did touch on several topics of ongoing presentations that we do run, and there is a section devoted to AIA trainings that we do on a recurring basis that's also on our website. I'll put it in the chat what our website is. If you want to go over there and check it out, I recommend you do so. It is www.pmcorp.com. But thanks everyone for your participation. Like I said, if you want to, look into upcoming presentations that we will get scheduled, it'll be on our calendar in the events section of our website. Also, as I mentioned before, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. If you were on and would review it, or reevaluate the slides, or if you just want to make sure that you didn't miss anything if you joined a little late, I recommend that you check that out. Our YouTube channel, I'll also put in the chat, is PMC Videos. That's videos with an S and all one word. You'll recognize the logo if you see it there in the bottom of Chris's slide. We've been putting all of our AIA trainings up there for you guys to check out. Also, I just want to reiterate about the AIA training number. So if you have your AIA number, please, I recommend putting it either in the chat, in the Q&A, or emailing me directly so that we make sure that you're tracked so that you get your accreditation. There is a lot of people who attended this presentation, so we will be slowly rolling out your certificates. But just know that when you've attended, we will take care of it and you will receive your accreditation. But if you feel like you haven't got it in a reasonable time, also be sure to reach out to make sure we didn't miss you. But other than that, thank you, Chris, for a great job in your presentation. Thank everyone for, asking the questions that you answered. That will conclude the webinar for today. So thank you guys and have a great day.
Thank you, too.